problem is that there are growing numbers of patients that are infected with organisms that are difficult, sometimes impossible to treat with currently available antibiotics. And that's the problem. These infections occur mainly in hospitals, but occasionally in other healthcare settings like nursing homes. The other issue is that there are some patients that get ordinary infections, simple infections like urinary tract infections, for which, for example, there's no oral therapy. So you end up giving them intravenous therapy or even bringing them into a hospital to give them this therapy just because there's no pill form of an antibiotic available that'll work for them. So that's the problem, and there are more and more of these patients. So what's being discussed now is they want to have legislation that essentially provides a legal mandate for the FDA to put this into place. But to a certain extent, the FDA has already put it into place without the legal mandate, and that's this unmet needs guidance that came out in July. So it's not clear to me that they actually need the legislation. I understand why they might want to have the legislation. I mean, having a legislative mandate is good. If something bad happens, and it almost certainly will, because the populations that you study will be small and the risk of a safety problem will be higher. So there will be a safety problem with one of these drugs. And I think the FDA does not want to get clobbered like they did after Ketek. So, I mean, I think that's another reason maybe why they want this legislation. But whether it's really necessary or not, I'm not so sure.
When you and I spoke in the past about this, we talked about how impossible it would be to sort of find somebody who has never taken antibiotics before to enroll in a trial like this.
Right.
And now there's, roughly 100 people that would be enrolled, you said?
Well, I think what these trials, in the guidance that was issued by the FDA, they accept a minimum trial size total of 300 patients. But of those 300 patients, probably only a few would have the kind of resistant infection that you need, and the total 300 would be part of the safety database for the agency. But you enroll them because you think they might have the infection that you need for your trial, but most of them won't.
So what are some of the dangers in having so few people involved in a trial like this, as you mentioned before?
Well, the biggest danger is the issue of safety, because if you only study a small number of patients, then some less common safety problem that might be associated with the drug you're not going to see. But when you think about it in perspective, today drugs are already being approved after studying 1,000 patients or 1,500 patients. So, the difference between 300 patients and 1,000 or 1,500 is not that great. But still, that's I think the biggest issue with that.
Do you think drug companies will be more likely to, want to get involved now?
Well, I think that it's going to take several things for drug companies to get involved. First place, more drug companies are involved. That's already happened. So Sanofi got back into the antibiotic game a couple of years ago, and Roche just announced they're getting back in with a purchase or license agreement with a company called Polyfor in Switzerland. And that Polyfor has an antibiotic that's active only against Pseudomonas aeruginosa. So they would have to theoretically, or one way to develop that drug would be via the so-called FDA unmet needs pathway. So companies are thinking about and acting and coming back into the antibiotic domain, which is good. The other thing that has to happen, aside from a more clear regulatory path, which is happening, is that we have to have pricing. Because if you're only going to sell this to a few thousand patients around the world, you're never going to make a return on investment unless the price is very high. So that's the other piece of the puzzle that I think still hasn't quite come into place yet. I don't remember if we talked about this, but there was this Pew Charitable Trust meeting back in January where they had payers present. And the payers seem perfectly willing to pay high prices for antibiotics against resistant infections with the understanding that they would actually work.
You sound cautiously optimistic.
I am cautiously optimistic because I actually think ultimately things will come together. I think the FDA will turn around. I think they are trying to turn around. I think they have a way to go. Um, I feel like I've been beating my head against this wall for a while, and a lot of other people have too, not just me. But I mean, I definitely see movement at the FDA, but I do think that they have a ways to go. I think the major piece of the struggle right now is going to be around companies being able to get a return on investment through pricing.